Okay, the very last thing I want to talk about is making and sharing. I think we often think about making and sharing entirely based on visitors creating stuff. And while that is interesting to me, there are lots of ways people can make and share. So it can be, writing comments on the wall, but it can also be, building things in the context of an exhibit, or even just pointing at things. This is another image from Race, and that idea of people sharing through what they intersect with in a museum. This last image is pretty brilliant. It's from the Minnesota History Museum. They had a problem with people, I'll show a bigger image of it, I think, this afternoon, but they had a problem with people who had admission buttons, that the buttons would just be littered through their parking lot, by the exit. And so what they did is they built this little kiosk. It says, "Thank you for visiting. What's your favorite exhibit? Drop your button in a bin to vote." And then there are names of exhibits. And so the idea is that instead of making trash, you're making some data, you're giving the museum some information, and I really think of that as a valid form of participation, that we don't have to always think about people making their own stuff. It can be selecting things, it can be expressing a preference. Unfortunately, the way that people fundamentally, absolutely above all other things, would like to share their experience in museums is through two activities that are often not allowed: taking pictures and talking on the phone. I understand there are very good copyright reasons why many museums cannot allow photographs to be taken. But from a visitor perspective, it can be really confusing or downright elitist feeling. This is a quote from a woman who, I wrote about this on my blog, and she's not a museum person, she's a museum visitor, and she talks about how photo restrictions make her feel like an institution is being elitist. Now, I know it's easy to look at this and say, well, she doesn't know about the copyright issues we have to deal with every time we have a new lender, or she doesn't know about our concerns relative to, light exposure or about theft. Well, first of all, the light exposure thing, I think, cell phone cameras have become so ubiquitous that that's become a diminished issue in terms of what people are actually doing. But I also think that if museums are saying that we are holding objects in the public trust, that is a very confusing idea to visitors. Because I gotta say, from a visitor perspective, visiting an object that supposedly you own in some way in a museum feels a lot more like visiting somebody in a hospital. You can only come at certain hours, you can't eat, you can't take the person out with you. And so I think that if we're going to genuinely say to people, these objects are yours, we are sharing these, we are taking care of them for you, we have to figure out ways to be generous about ways they can be shared so that people can understand and make that connection and not see museums as a destination that's owned by somebody else, but see it as a community resource that they feel they need to support. I want to share one last example of a museum that I think did a really brilliant job of playing with making and sharing. This is a ceramics museum in the Netherlands called Prinses Hof, and they decided to do this exhibition, which I can't pronounce. That's the name in Dutch. The name in English was Shards and Happiness. It was an exhibit of wedding china. Now, I don't know about you, I'm not really a ceramics museum person. I can't really imagine being psyched about a wedding china show. But they did a bunch of things with this exhibition to make it something that was more about the community and more about making and sharing. So first of all, they put out a solicitation and they invited people to share their own wedding china and their own images from celebrations. This is a picture from a wedding between two people who were only married for a few years before the husband was killed in the Holocaust. This dish set sat locked in a closet for about 70 years until this grandmother of the person who contributed it died, and this young woman talked about how sharing it connected her to her grandmother and to her grandfather who she never met. So they had this element. This worked so well, but they decided also to have a design competition and let people design wedding china, and then they actually fired the best of them and put them on display. And then finally, and perhaps the most extraordinary museum program I've ever seen, they decided to have a wedding for a day. They had dresses, they had bouquets, and you could come and get married for 24 hours at the museum. That was fun, but it also, think about this. This is a ceramics museum, and they were saying, hey, we're not just about these dishes. We believe that these objects are about the celebrations and the way we use these things. And curators know that, educators know that. That's why we're passionate about the collections we work with. But through all these programs, they were able to help people make that connection themselves and feel like, oh yeah, this museum, these objects are part of my life and part of my story. The very last thing I want to say is this, which is that small museums are better at doing all of this than large museums ever will be. Starbucks has opened these new coffee shops that are these those fake community coffee shops. You know, they, like 15th Avenue Coffee and Tea, and they're honest, they say inspired by Starbucks, but they are trying to be more like a personal community place. And so I really want to encourage you to not worry about being like the Getty or being like the Smithsonian, because I think there are things that smaller museums can do a heck of a lot better, frankly, than those institutions can do. And particularly when we look culturally at what people want from a cultural institution now, that I think that museums that are smaller can be those places for everyday use, for sharing, and can be those places that people see as an alternative to the coffee shop or the bar in their communities. So that's my thing. Thank you.